The streets of the Vancouver downtown Eastside were a maze of flickering neon, crumbling sidewalks, and desperation etched into every face. This was a world most people walked past without notice, a place where addiction, poverty, and crime intertwined so tightly that the tragedies of the residents became invisible. And it was here that Robert William Pickton, outwardly unremarkable, would begin a reign of terror that would shock a nation. Robert was born in 1949, one of 6 children, raised on a struggling family farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. The Pickton family was well known locally, but not for warmth or compassion. There were rumors, whispered behind closed doors, of abuse, neglect, and dysfunction, a childhood shadowed by violence and secrets. It was the perfect soil for the seeds of a mind that could compartmentalize horror and maintain a facade of normalcy. To his neighbors, Robert was quiet, awkward, a man who kept to himself. He worked with his family, tended the pigs, repaired the barns, and made himself useful around the farm. There was nothing overtly threatening in his demeanor, but beneath the surface, a meticulous, patient, and calculating mind was growing, a mind capable of exploiting society's blind spots and preying on the most vulnerable. The downtown Eastside offered him opportunity. Sex workers and drug users vanished routinely, their absences dismissed, uninvestigated. Friends worried, shelters wondered, but the authorities rarely connected the dots, and the city's elite never looked too closely. It was here that Pickton honed his predation, learning how to blend into the fabric of a community while simultaneously becoming its predator. He lured women to his farm with promises, cash for sex, temporary work, companionship, simple things that seemed ordinary in a world where survival was already perilous. Once inside, the facade dissolved. The farm was no longer a pastoral landscape, but a stage for unspeakable acts, a carefully hidden theater of cruelty. Pigs, pens, barns, and empty fields became tools for both concealment and horror, while Robert's outwardly calm demeanor allowed him to operate in plain sight. Neighbors occasionally noticed anomalies: a woman seen entering his property and never leaving, strange noises, muffled cries, thuds, sudden silences. Yet no one dared question him too closely. He had built his reputation carefully, polite, helpful, unassuming, a quiet man with a family business, the perfect cover for someone whose crimes would remain hidden for years. By the time authorities began piecing together the pattern of disappearances, decades of victims had passed through his farm, each life erased, each disappearance leaving a faint trace in police records, in whispers along the streets, in the hearts of families desperate for answers. And so the first act closes not with discovery, but with suspense. A quiet farm in Port Coquitlam, a man who looks ordinary, and a darkness growing stronger, hidden behind fences, barns, and the stench of pigs.
Port Coquitlam was quiet, almost idyllic. From the street, Robert Pickton's farm looked like any other rural property. Pigs grunting in pens, rusted barns creaking in the wind, the smell of manure heavy in the summer air. But beneath this veneer of ordinary farm life, a sinister pattern was taking shape. The farm itself was deceptively functional. One barn housed the pigs. Another, meticulously cleaned, became a storage area for the objects of his darker pursuits. He maintained the property with care, repairing fences, clearing brush, and ensuring that visitors saw only what he wanted them to see. He was methodical, calculating, and patient. Every detail of the farm worked in service of secrecy. His victims were drawn to him slowly, often unknowingly. Women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, marginalized, struggling, and overlooked, would be offered small jobs, money, or rides to safety. Pickton knew their routines, their vulnerabilities. To them, he seemed like a friendly, harmless man, the local farmer, the neighbor, the helper. No one suspected that the pig pens, the empty barns, and the hidden rooms would become instruments of unspeakable horror. Once on the farm, the illusion disappeared. Witnesses and later confessions revealed a grim pattern: isolation, manipulation, and then violence. Some victims were strangled. Others were stabbed. Some, horrifyingly, were subjected to methods designed to ensure they would not survive and would leave no trace. The farm's animals became grim accomplices, pigs that consumed human remains, making recovery and investigation nearly impossible. Pickton's methods were grotesquely systematic. He kept detailed records, maps, and notes, not for notoriety, but to ensure that the crimes could continue without detection. The brutality was hidden beneath routine farm work. Blood-stained tools were cleaned or discarded, tracks concealed in mud, evidence masked by the chaotic life of the animals and the land. Even as rumors circulated, women disappearing, strange noises coming from the property, and odd deliveries of materials, authorities were slow to act. The victims' social status, their marginalization, meant that disappearances were often dismissed or deprioritized. Pickton exploited this societal blind spot with cold precision, understanding that no one would look too closely at a man who seemed harmless, at a farm where noise and dirt were expected. Neighbors occasionally noted odd behaviors. Some described women entering the property at night, never to return. Others reported strange smells, screams muffled by the wind, or suspicious deliveries of large sacks. Yet the pattern was dismissed. A city desensitized, a law enforcement system under-resourced, and a predator who understood both. The farm became a quiet empire of horror. Year after year, Pickton expanded his network of lures and traps. The pigs, ever present, became both cover and instrument, consuming what could not be disposed of in any other way. Tools, clothing, and personal effects disappeared, leaving no trace for families searching for missing loved ones. By the late 1980s, a grim legend had begun to form among those who knew the downtown East Side. Women whispered of the farm. They told each other to be careful, to avoid the quiet man who offered rides or work. But the warnings were vague, because no one had seen the full extent of the horror, and few had ever confronted it directly. Pickton's patience and cunning ensured that his crimes could continue for decades. Each act of violence was carefully calculated, every detail hidden behind the mask of normalcy. And while the city carried on oblivious, the farm became a silent graveyard, a place where society's blind spots allowed evil to flourish.
The Port Coquitlam farm was a place that looked ordinary by day, but once inside its barns and back rooms, the ordinary veil vanished. The smell of manure was constant, but beneath it there was a more sinister odor: blood, decay, and the faint, coppery tang of death.
This was not a place of animals alone. It had become a theater for a man whose mind treated murder as routine, almost banal. The barns were deceptively large. One contained the pigs, moving through mud and waste, entirely unaware of the horrors surrounding them. Another, quieter, hidden from sight, became the space where Pickton lured his victims. Women arrived, thinking they would find work, safety, or money. Once inside, the calm, polite exterior he presented dissolved. The violence was swift, controlled, deliberate. Pickton's methods were both improvisational and systematic. Some women were strangled, others stabbed. But more disturbing were the details of how he concealed evidence. Pigs, omnipresent and voracious, were used to consume flesh, erasing traces. Blood was washed away, clothes burned or hidden. He created a system where the crimes could continue without leaving recoverable evidence, relying on the chaos of a working farm to mask the atrocities. Inside the barns, the psychological horror was palpable. The cries of victims were muffled by walls, doors, and animals, yet sometimes they pierced the stillness, audible to those unlucky enough to glimpse the property. Tools, knives, ropes, and makeshift restraints were meticulously organized, ready for use. Every act was calculated, every movement planned. Pickton's demeanor, calm, almost casual, made him all the more terrifying. Neighbors sometimes noted odd deliveries of large sacks or boxes. Pickton insisted they contained animal feed or farm supplies. Few questioned him. No one imagined the grotesque reality. And while rumors circulated, missing women, strange noises, odd smells, authorities had little evidence to act upon. The victims' social status, primarily sex workers marginalized by society, meant their disappearances were often ignored or treated as inconsequential. Years passed. The farm grew. Pickton refined his methods, each crime blending into routine, each disappearance leaving behind a faint trail of suspicion but no proof. His victims became statistics, files in police drawers, brief mentions in newspapers, or whispers among those who frequented the downtown East Side. But to Pickton, they were merely part of a system, fuel for a pattern of horror he controlled entirely. There were occasional glimpses of his dual life. On the streets of Vancouver, he was quiet, polite, a man who helped with local chores and sometimes donated small amounts of money. To anyone meeting him briefly, he seemed harmless, even helpful. But back at the farm, he was a predator, a meticulous orchestrator of pain and death. The contrast was chilling. A man who could cross between two worlds, leaving the gruesome world hidden from society, invisible to those who might have stopped him. Even his family seemed unaware. While Pickton lived and worked among them, the full extent of his crimes remained hidden. To neighbors, he was eccentric but unthreatening. To the world outside, he was invisible. To those trapped inside his farm, he was a nightmare. By the late 1990s, the scope of his crimes had grown so extensive that the farm had become a labyrinth of horror. Pigs roaming among barns and pens, human remains carefully concealed, victims' belongings scattered or destroyed. The property itself seemed to swallow the evidence, the chaos of animals and machinery, masking the darkest truths of a man who had perfected the art of disappearing without a trace. The tension in the city was building. The missing women, the rumors, the occasional sightings of strange sacks or deliveries, all were pieces of a puzzle that had yet to be solved. The world outside the farm continued, oblivious, while the horrors inside escalated, each act more chilling than the last. By the late 1990s, the whispers could no longer be ignored. Families of missing women pressed authorities. The downtown Eastside community became increasingly vocal, and police slowly began to connect the threads. But even as the investigation began, the true scale of Pickton's crimes remained almost unimaginable. The first break came in 1997, when a woman narrowly escaped his farm. She had been lured under the pretense of money and work, but she managed to flee, providing the first hands-on account of the horrors inside. Her description of the barns, the pens, the dark spaces where women had been held began to build a chilling picture. But it would take years for law enforcement to move decisively. The RCMP, local police, and eventually the combined efforts of multiple agencies began to investigate Pickton. Officers scoured the downtown Eastside for missing women, cross-referencing reports spanning decades. They interviewed families, friends, and associates, slowly piecing together a pattern. All the women disappeared after interacting with the same man. When authorities finally focused on the farm, they were unprepared for what they would find. The property appeared ordinary from the outside, but as investigators entered the barns, the stench of decay hit them immediately. Piles of animal feed, bags of fertilizer, and ordinary farming equipment masked a grotesque reality. Evidence of human remains, carefully concealed but unmistakably present. Inside the barns, officers discovered pockets of horror. Bone fragments, personal items, and remnants of victims' clothing were hidden among pig pens and storage areas. The investigators were forced to confront a systemized killer whose crimes had been concealed for decades through meticulous planning and the chaotic environment of a working farm. Pickton's own admissions, once interrogated, were chilling. He spoke casually of acts that would stagger any investigator. Victims lured, murdered, and disposed of with efficiency. Some of the details were almost inconceivable. The use of pigs to eliminate evidence, the careful concealment of remains, and the decades-long illusion of justice. As the news broke, the public reaction was of horror and outrage. Vancouver, a city proud of its culture and community, was forced to confront the unimaginable. The downtown Eastside community, long marginalized, became a focal point for both grief and anger, demanding accountability for a tragedy that had been ignored for too long. The scale of the crimes made headlines worldwide. Police estimated that Pickton had killed at least 49 women, though many suspected the true number was higher. The farm, once a quiet corner of Port Coquitlam, became infamous, a symbol of neglect, oversight, and the dark capacity for human evil. The investigation also revealed institutional failings. Social services, police departments, and the broader community had repeatedly overlooked warnings. Missing person reports were deprioritized. Calls for help were ignored. Each failure allowed Pickton to continue his crimes longer than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation culminated, Pickton was arrested in 2002. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, and the details of his crimes began to be revealed in court. Families, investigators, and the public were forced to confront decades of horror, meticulously orchestrated and hidden in plain sight. Even after his arrest, the story continued to unfold. The farm was searched extensively, and more remains were discovered, confirming the horrifying scale of his crimes. Witnesses testified to the abuses and disappearances, revealing the human cost of Pickton's decades-long campaign of terror.
The courtroom in Vancouver was tense, heavy with anticipation and grief. Families of missing women filled the seats, some stoic, others barely holding back tears, each carrying decades of unanswered questions. Across from them sat Robert Pickton, quiet and seemingly detached, his calm demeanor only amplifying the horror of the crimes he had committed. The trial began in earnest in 2007, focusing on the 26 murders for which prosecutors felt they had the strongest evidence. But as testimony unfolded, it became clear that Pickton's crimes were far more extensive, stretching into the decades-long disappearances of vulnerable women across Vancouver. Families recounted loved ones last seen alive, voices trembling as they described encounters with the man who had preyed upon them with meticulous calculation. Investigators took the stand, painting a picture of unimaginable horror. The Port Coquitlam farm, once a seemingly mundane property, was described in painstaking detail. The barns, pens, and hidden areas where Pickton had lured, restrained, and murdered victims. The use of pigs to dispose of human remains. The ingenious concealment of evidence in feed bins and storage areas. Each revelation stunned the courtroom. Each detail elicited gasps, tears, and murmurs of disbelief. Survivors testified as well. Women who had narrowly escaped shared harrowing stories of deception, manipulation, and sheer terror. They described how Pickton had isolated them, how he had calculated their every move, and how close they had come to becoming another unrecorded statistic. Their courage brought the chilling reality of the crimes into stark focus, proving that the horror was not myth, it was tangible, methodical, and deliberate. Pickton himself rarely showed emotion. His calm, sometimes disarming presence contrasted with the chaos of testimony and evidence, leaving an eerie impression on all who witnessed him. This contrast, ordinary man and monstrous killer, only intensified the public fascination and revulsion. The verdict, when it came, was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Pickton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder, though the number of potential victims was believed to be far higher. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for 25 years, a measure some felt inadequate given the scale of his crimes. The families, the city, and the world were left to grapple with the reality that justice, while delivered in part, could not undo decades of pain, fear, and loss. The legacy of Robert Pickton extends beyond the courtroom. His crimes exposed societal blind spots, the vulnerability of marginalized women, the oversight of law enforcement, and the indifference of a community that too often ignored the missing. Downtown Eastside activists and advocates used the tragedy to push for reform, demanding better protection, attention, and accountability for those most at risk. The Port Coquitlam farm, once a place of horror hidden behind fences and animals, has become an enduring symbol of human cruelty. Its story is told in documentaries, books, and news articles, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. Even decades later, Vancouver and Canada continue to reckon with the implications of Pickton's crimes. The victims' names, once neglected and forgotten, are now remembered. Their stories serve as both a warning and a testament to resilience. Communities honor their memory, ensuring that while Pickton may have escaped detection for years, the women he victimized will never be forgotten. Robert Pickton remains in prison, a man whose quiet exterior masked a methodical, monstrous cruelty. His name evokes horror, fascination, and disbelief, but the story is ultimately about more than him. It is about the victims, the families, the investigators, and a society forced to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, oversight, and the human capacity for evil. The darkness of Port Coquitlam's farm has passed into history, yet its shadow lingers. It serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that monsters may walk among us, and that vigilance, empathy, and justice are never optional. And so the story closes, not with peace, but with reflection, horror, and remembrance. The farm is gone, Pickton is imprisoned, but the memory of his crimes endures, carved into the history of Vancouver and into the collective consciousness of all who hear the tale.
If you enjoyed today's video, we thank you very much. Please like and subscribe to Rare Breed Chronicles. And let's dive into another story that defies the ordinary.